My name is Richard Yanda, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law, and I've been given the pleasant task of serving as moderator this evening. What I intend to do briefly is just give you an outline of how the evening will be unfolding, how we're going to present the items of business here. I will introduce the participants that we have at the session, and then I'm going to turn it over briefly to my friend and colleague, David Gisbert. So what we wanted to do this evening, I say we, I'm actually speaking on behalf of the organizers who've done a wonderful job in pulling the evening together. The goal is to have a conversation, and a conversation around three themes. The first theme that we want to address is what has been entitled Addressing the Divide. And really, the idea here is to look at how the expansion of the Canadian mining industry, especially across Latin America but elsewhere as well, has unfolded, and what sets of issues have been created through that expansion. The word divide, I suppose, referring to the fact that we now have some cleavage, some division between support and conflict having unfolded because of the presence of the Canadian mining industry. The second theme, and so the idea is we're going to talk about that among the panelists for roughly 20 minutes or so. Depending on how that conversation goes, we might then open briefly for some questions at that point. But then we would head into the second part of the evening, the second theme, which is being entitled Forum Convenience, that legal term referring to what is the right place, the right forum in which to address conflicts, legal conflicts as they might arise. The backdrop of this being that we've had cases that have been brought in Canada against Canadian mining companies for their activities abroad, and sometimes courts have actually allowed for those cases to unfold, particularly the recent Hudbay case, which we might touch upon. But the more general aspect of this, the second theme will be where and through what means should we be addressing the issues that were flagged in the first part of our discussion. And then the last part of our discussion will really be an effort to look forward, look into the future as to how these questions might now be addressed, and what new sets of problems might arise in the future. So that's the way the evening will be organized. We will reserve to the end of the session an additional period of questions, although John McKay, one of our panelists, has to leave to catch a flight, so they have to head out of here in the midst of that discussion. Let me now introduce our distinguished panelists. So sitting on my right, which is entirely appropriate coincidence, but sitting there is John McKay, who, as he's now proud to say, is a Liberal MP from part of the Ford Nation in Scarborough-Guildwood. He was. Sorry about that. He became among initiatives that he was involved with over time. Many of you will know about his initiative, the leadership he took around Bill C-300, which was a private member's bill that was introduced in the minority parliament, the previous minority parliament, and came very close to being adopted. The Corporate Accountability of Mining, Oil, and Gas Corporations in Developing Countries Act, which may not trip off the tongue exactly, but which was a significant initiative to provide accountability mechanisms for Canadian mining companies. And he is now, again, as many of you will know, in the midst of working on Bill C-474, and this is no longer a minority government, so the private members' bills are not quite as likely to succeed, but this one has been called the Sunshine Bill, and it has to do with basically disclosure of information about monies that are being paid by companies abroad. Our second panelist, sitting this time on my left, Jamie Green, from which may be appropriate. Although I'm happy to move further to the left, frankly. Is mining from Mining Watch Canada. Many of you will know that Mining Watch is leading NGO that has been working on highlighting and bringing attention to the impact of Canadian mining companies abroad, obviously with respect to their environmental impacts, but also with respect to human rights impacts on Indigenous groups and so on. Jamie in particular has been responsible for the work of Mining Watch on environmental assessment policy, uranium issues, and the African Regional Program. There is a kind of, I don't know, there's some sort of a symmetry. There is some sort of a symmetry here. Normand Champigny, we're very pleased to have Normand with us, is a senior mining professional who's worked internationally in the mining industry. He's a co-chair of the Corporate Social Responsibility Department at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. I must say I'm particularly grateful to Normand for joining this panel because coming to a university to speak to these issues is sometimes not seen as coming to home turf, but as Normand says, he was a student too, I'm sure this goes without saying. I hope this goes without saying, but it is not the case that Normand is here to be our kind of token mining person to be pilloried. We are actually anxious to engage in a constructive conversation, and so it's really in that spirit that delighted that he's here. He's the former president of Golden Alliance, which was a company that had stakes in gold, copper, and silver exploration in Peru, and is now the president of Donner Metals in Quebec. I guess symmetry, I don't know, maybe a different kind of symmetry now is to have Jim Cooney here. Jim has been, I'm sure many of you have been exposed to his work, and he's been a dynamic teacher now in the International Development Program at McGill University. But before taking up that role, he was Vice President of International Government Affairs at what was then Placer Dome. He was actively engaged in the extractive industries review process that was taken up by the World Bank from 2002 to 2004. And then he was an advisor for the International Financial Corporation's performance standards, which are quite elaborate and rigorous with respect to social and environmental sustainability. If I remember properly, actually, some of those standards were even referenced in Bill C-300. So important work that was done in that domain. And then finally, Graham Russell from Rights Action is an activist who has been working with communities particularly affected by human rights impacts in Central America. Rights Action, which Graham actually founded, is an NGO that works with indigenous and campesino communities for justice and reparation. And his group funds and works with community organizations on alliances and supporting projects for community development, the environment, and human rights. So we've got, I think, a fascinating and wide-ranging panel of people to engage on these questions. Before, though, we turn to our first theme, I wanted to invite my friend David Ginsberg just to say a few words to sort of give us background as to how this event arose.
Microphone. Unless people can hear me clearly if I speak like this. That's fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Becky Smith, one of the organizers for tonight's evening, asked me 3 things. The first thing, she asked me to recognize and acknowledge the fact that we were on Haudenosaunee land. So I'm happy to do that. She also asked that you, on the way out, have a look at the photos. You may not have seen this and you have to get into this room, but all around the room on the outside is a quite wonderful photo exhibit done by Jaime Rodriguez, documenting some of the impacts of some of these conflicts involving Canadian mining companies and local communities in Guatemala and Honduras, I believe, but Guatemala for sure. And the third thing, she said, keep it short, so 10 minutes. And she said, well, okay, background for 10 minutes. So what I thought I'd do is, I will really try and hold that to 10 minutes. And I would just simply put out 10 facts and give a minute to each fact. All right, fact number 1, you may already know this, but I just want to flesh this out a little bit, is that Canadian mining companies have a very important presence in Latin America, in the Latin American sector, and you can measure this any way you want. You can measure it by the number of companies, so close to 500 companies currently operating across the continent. You can measure it in the number of mining projects that they are developing. And a mining project, for those of you with a bit of background on this, is everything from claiming a piece of land, a concession, doing some exploratory work, to the actual running and development of a mine. So when we say actually 1,500 mining projects, we're not talking about 1,500 mines as such. So we can say some sort of the same thing about the mining companies themselves. So we say 500 mining companies sounds like a lot. Many of them are very small. It's not sure that they'll actually survive the year, given how things are going in the mining industry these days. Other ways that you can measure this is just kind of presence, geographical presence. All those concessions that are held by Canadian companies amount to quite a sizable amount of land. And so you have some of the statistics there. It's quite remarkable. I mean, Mexico's not a small country, but close to a quarter of the land mass is held in concession, or there's a mining concession held by a Canadian company across that area. And then you have some of the other representative countries. Okay. Second point. We talk about a mining industry, but the mining industry, our mining industry, insofar as it works in Latin America, is mainly a precious metals industry. So the vast majority of the projects are either working gold or silver, and the next sort of bracket is copper. And I point this out for 2 reasons. One is that there's always an argument with regards to mining about its usefulness. When you look, so you have to ask the use question with regards to precious metals. But the other point, I think, is how people in Latin America see this search for gold and silver, given their historical context, given the role that gold and silver has played in the past, since the 16th century, in different cycles of occupation and arrival of outsiders. And whatever you think of that perspective, it actually is socially alive in the concept, which is explained some of the responses that Latin Americans have had to our industry there. The third point is that we're talking about a very large industry that moves a tremendous amount of value out of Canada into these countries, back out of these countries. Running a mine, getting it into actual operation is hundreds of millions of dollars enterprise, up to billions of dollars enterprise. So these are the largest mines running in Latin America are of the same scale as a bitumen oil sands mine. This is the scale that we're operating at. And so we are talking about billions of dollars kind of moving into places like Guatemala or Mexico to pay for the trucks, the wages, and so on. It creates an enormous amount of economic activity in the mine site. It actually has a very strong effect on entire national economies. So it has a very major role to play. There's a lot of people who work on these projects. These are big projects, hundreds of people, thousands of people can find employment through these projects. So it's an important economic effect. Per gram of material produced, open pit gold mining, which is what we're mainly talking about when we talk about mining in Latin America, generates the largest amount of environmental externalities than any other human activity, if you use that metric. This is simply because the physical scales at which we're operating are huge compared to the actual product that we're taking out, which in the case of gold is actually quite, by volume or weight, actually quite small. Open pit mining has gotten scaled up to the point where we have pits in Mexico and opening up in Panama and elsewhere that are kilometers in diameter, a kilometer in depth. These photos that you're seeing are all taken from Nevada. That's simply because it's only in Nevada where the same technologies are applied that someone got up into a plane and took photos. This is really kind of the only place you can actually kind of really appreciate the scale at which we're operating now. So scale has consequences. Scale has consequences in terms of the amount of water you need, millions of liters per day. It has consequences in terms of the amount of material that you're bringing to the surface, material that is often laden in heavy metals, often bearing sulfides, and these have potentially very serious environmental impacts. And this is a major concern for mine operators, is to contain those materials, and to contain them not just during the duration of the mine, which could be 10 to 20 to 30 years, but insofar as humans are concerned, for a very, very long time, so thousands of years, given the presence and how those metals work. The last point to put out here about the scale is also about energy inputs. And this is kind of a conversation that hitches to issues of climate change and so on. The amount of energy that is used in a mine, for instance, there's a large mine in Mexico, it will use in about a month what a small Canadian town will use in a year. And most of that energy is produced through coal burning or through diesel burning. And that makes this sector a particularly high emitter of greenhouse gases. So this is an environmental challenge for this industry, just simply because of the scale at which they're operating. In Latin America, unlike Canada, mining projects are never remote. They're never distant from communities that actually depend on the land base around those mines. Okay, so when we did the research on this, we just compiled all the projects in Mexico, and we came up with an average population density. This is something around the line of what you have up in the Laurentians. So it's a landscape, or social landscape, of small villages, many small villages, so speckled around. This is a map that one of the students made of a number of projects in Oaxaca. The black points are all small towns and villages. Okay? That's what a map looks like. This is what some of this may look like, or does look like, in Mexico or in other places. This is mining operations are abutting on communities themselves. And of course, given the need for water and for the mine and the need for water for the communities, you have a sort of underlying structural tension, if not to say conflict, over that resource, which I'm sure other people will get into more. The whole issue of the environmental impacts and how it connects to social impacts is a big one. I can't get through it in 1 minute. So I'll just put it out there. Hopefully we'll talk about it more in time. This is just sorry, I should have played that as I was talking, but it's simply an inventory we made of all recorded rivers in Latin America that were, in which there was a contamination incident associated with a Canadian mining company. Okay? So alleged, Very few of these are actually proven. People see effects, claim effects, fish kills, animal kills, and so on. But there is actually no proof for any of these, and that's actually maybe an issue for us to talk about, simply because the water sample wasn't taken at the time of the transaction. But there was actually quite a few cases. The underlying tension between companies, their operations, and communities has led to a rise in the number of conflicts involving communities and Canadian companies. A few years ago, when we started gathering up this information, we were up to about a few dozen cases. Today we're just under 100, around 100 or so, and they exist all across Latin America. Every country, I believe, except for Paraguay has, no, Paraguay does have it, so Uruguay has a mining conflict associated with it. The conflicts are rooted in violations of rights, or alleged violations of rights, concerns over environmental contamination, labor conflicts. There's a whole bandwidth of issues that are driving this. It used to be that people would claim that these conflicts were just the kind of the work of a few disgruntled campesinos or some sort of agitating NGOs, environmental NGOs from the north, kind of agitating the work. But what we've seen over time is how these conflicts have gone from very local events to actually very substantial and large social movements all across the continent. So now, there are major confrontations, involving thousands of people. In Panama, the mining conflict led to the shutting down the country for about a week, twice, 2 successive years. And so it's harder now to say that there's a kind of isolated event. It's part of the new kind of political scenario or landscape across the continent. Partially in response to this, and actually, I have to say, taking a kind of a proactive position on some of the risks involved with mining. The mining industry, since the 90s, has really driven an effort to mitigate harms, avoid harms, through a number of guidelines and norms that we come to know as CSR, and that this is kind of the topic of tonight's conversation. Okay. They cover a wide range of aspects. They cover norms on community relations, the handling of hazardous waste, respect for indigenous rights. There are auditing mechanisms now in place and auditing organizations that go in and make sure that these norms are being are actually complied with. And pretty well now, all the big players, all the larger companies in the mining industry have CSR policies of one form or another integrated into their operations, and will have some of them will have entire divisions dedicated to that. So there'll be a VP in charge of community relations, environmental management, and so on, in which people who are affected by those harms seek redress. And of course, they seek redress in all sorts of different ways. That can go from judicial action locally. They go present themselves at local courts. We've seen some very important kind of Supreme Court decisions, shutting down entire mining operations in different parts of the continent. They take political action, also leading for change of laws and so on. But what's interesting, and what I want to bring it to us here today, is that they're also seeking redress in Canada. They're talking to people. At first, they talk to people that who are Canadians, NGOs or academics who are working in those in their areas, and asking them, what can be done on the Canadian side. People would present themselves in front of Canadian embassies with letters and documentation of conflicts involving a Canadian company. That has rapidly morphed into demonstrations in front of Canadian embassies. I don't have the actual table here, but there is a demonstration in front of the Canadian embassy somewhere in Latin America in any given month of the year. Last year, that's for sure. It's been kind of practice. People are coming to Canada saying, asking for help with other issues. In some cases, they've come to the courts, and this is the background for part of the conversation today. In 3 different occasions, communities, people representing communities, have taken sought redress through Canadian courts. On those 3 occasions, they were all rejected for the issue of forum non-convenience, which is to say that the case should not be tried here in Canada since the action and the harm was done there, either in Guyana or Guatemala or sorry, Guyana, Ecuador, or Congo, in these 3 cases. Currently, there is a case being heard in Toronto that has stuck. It was not sort of rejected, and will go forward. And this is why we're talking today, because this is a precedent-setting situation. And we see what the consequences, the implications of that. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the policy of the current Canadian government has mainly been to develop better CSR. And they've done it in a number of different ways, through a number of different initiatives. They set up the office of the CSR counselor, who would help dialogues between affected communities and the companies who were involved. We've had 3 cases so far. In all 3 cases, the company withdrew from the proceedings. There's no way of holding them there. They chose not to continue with the proceedings, and so this hasn't gone very far. The counselor herself has also just recently resigned. DFAD now, it used to be CETA, has been promoting mining development partnerships, and also the transfer of CSR expertise, Canadian CSR expertise, because we do have a home industry in this, to the continent, to Latin America. And as a most recent kind of version of this is the formation of the Canadian International Institute for Extractive Industries and Development, based at UBC and Simon Fraser. They're still working this out. So $25 million in order to help developing countries benefit from their natural resources in environmentally and socially responsible ways. Last point. Almost every single adult Canadian has money invested in a mining company that is operating in Latin America. It mainly goes through the big funds that we have our savings in. It also goes through the major banks that fund these different companies. This is mainly because such a large part of the TSX is occupied by funding for the mining sector in a large extent. So this is Canadian Pension Plan Holdings. The minute you start work, you're contributing to this, and the first 20 or so on the list, but the list goes all the way down quite a bit further. Big funds and banks are funding the large companies like Goldcorp. So just to take the example of Goldcorp, a company I'm sure we'll hear about later in the discussion, it's the Bank of Montreal, it's TD, CIBC, Desjardins, it's the Canadian Pension Plan, it's the Ontario Teachers Fund, it's the Caisse de dépôt et de placement, and it's also small investors like McGill University. It's only it's got like about $1.5 million kind of in Goldcorp. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that of connection. That the money that goes into these companies is a thread of connection that kind of connects us in some kind of way to what is happening down in Latin America. It's not just the story of what is happening in that distant place far to the south. It is very much the story of what's happening here, and that's where I'm really happy that so many of you are here to hear the rest of this conversation. So I think I made it on 10 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, David, for setting the scene. I'm sure that many of the themes that David touched upon will come up in our conversations now. So I'll just remind you that our first theme we're calling Addressing the Divide, and really trying to look at what has happened as this picture David now painted of mining companies growing in significance, Canadian mining companies growing in significance abroad, has also come with conflict. Maybe one way to capture this and open the discussion is the story that was told to me by one of my students who was traveling in Latin America 4 years ago and came back quite quite upset because she had gone there on the assumption that if she put a Canadian flag on her knapsack, that this would be, the good PR move to make. Just a Canadian going around in America, and she found herself faced with great hostility, which surprised her, and then was trying to figure out what this was about, and found herself being associated with this Canadian footprint of the mining industry. So I wondered, maybe I can ask Jamie to sort of launch it. How do you understand the situation as it's unfolded sort of over time? Has there been a trend line from your vantage point of Canadian activities, or how do you see what has unfolded?
Well, I think Davikin really set the stage for that, because in a way that's how Mining Watch came about, was that mining was expanding in parts of Canada and running into increasing resistance and questioning from First Nations, from Inuit, from environmental groups, from community groups. But at the same time, the Canadian mining industry was expanding through the 1990s, as Davikin laid out, and Canadian organizations were hearing from their partners in Peru, in Costa Rica, and all across the continent, really. Community groups coming and saying, okay, we're supposed to be working on this forestry project, but the forest has been claimed by a Canadian mining company, and there isn't going to be any forest there if they go ahead with this project. So what do we do, and how do we deal with this? And we realized there really wasn't a knowledge or expertise in Canada in the nonprofit sector, and there really wasn't much of a network or information base across the continent. Now there is. And I think part of what's happened is that the information and the experience is now shared. We see peasants and indigenous people in El Salvador wanting to know what a mining operation looks like, what a Canadian mining operation looks like. So they can go to Guatemala, they can go to Honduras, they can talk to people from there, and they can say, they can learn what the impacts are likely to be and what the key issues are that they need to be aware of. At the same time, I think expectations have changed. So, I mean, even in Canada, in the 1950s, people could be relocated to make way for the St. Lawrence Seaway, perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable. First Nations were relocated. The impacts were socially and economically horrible. The aftermath is still being felt, but it was, that's the way it was. That's no longer acceptable to white people or to Indigenous people in Canada, and increasingly around the world, that the expectations of having your own place to live, having a livelihood that you can make a living and feed yourself and your family, having clean water to drink, those expectations are now being put ahead of government priorities or the profits of some other investor. And I think that's where the conflict is emerging. And the more people see, again, as Davikin pointed out, that these projects are really not for them, and what we need that much gold for is a very good question. It's really emerged as much more of a global theme.
Well, I wonder, another way of thinking about this, of course, is as a good news story, at least dimensions of good news to this story, that we have had, investment flowing, that we've had new job opportunities. There are also stories about communities that are seeking investment, and not just communities that are resisting presence of mining companies. There's been, as Davikin mentioned, the CSR developments, greater and greater sophistication, one might argue, about how to engage with communities. Mining companies hiring sociologists, learning about local ways, involving local communities. So how do you see these trend lines?
First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me tonight. I used to be a student, spent 8 years in university, and it's great to be among students tonight. For those who are wondering about the tie, this is the geology map of Quebec. It's for sale by the government of Quebec. Geology and exploration here. And as a mining company, you need a large territory to explore. The territory is your laboratory. You test where you're going to find mines, and only out of 1,000 prospects, one may become a mine. Right now, that's still the batting average. In some parts of the world, in Latin America, yes, there are areas that are heavily populated, and there are lots of communities. And clearly, when a number of mining companies from Canada came in the early 90s and late 90s, some, and I'm speaking for myself here, were more careful than others, and some were less careful. Not because they were trying to be deliberately less careful, because they didn't know any better. I think the industry has learned a lot since then as well. It's an evolving situation. We've developed standards as an industry. You've seen some of them in the list that was shown earlier. Countries where the level of education tends to be lower, I would say, because I spent a fair amount of time as well in other countries in Latin America, the challenges are greater because of the gap in knowledge. There have been a number of successes, yes, but of course we hear, unfortunately, about some of the few bad actors that are still out there. And as an industry, we are concerned about the bad actors. And one of the challenges is to make sure there are fewer bad actors. But yes, today a mining company has sociologists, anthropologists, biologists. One of them, well-known gold company here in Canada, she's a VP Environment, but really they call her Mother Nature. She's all about finding out what the natural environment is before doing anything. I think we need to also have a balance between the good stories that are there that are difficult to talk about and the media often are not focusing on, whereas the bad stories, unfortunately, there are. I agree there are a few of them, but we still hear about them that come to haunt us as an industry.
Well, I wonder if I could bring Jim into this, because Jim was involved in developing, seeking to develop some of the standards that would apply to the mining industry, and presumably, the reason for standards is not just because everything is going well, but because there needs to be also some form of accountability. Although I guess if a company has a social license to operate and can demonstrate that it is following high standards, that might be seen as part of its, part of what it can bring. So how do you see the evolution of standards and the evolution of sophistication of the industry?
Okay. Well, let me put this into context. The main set of standards that I was involved in developing was an initiative of the World Bank. The standards themselves were done through the commercial arm of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation. But the context in which those standards were developed was that mineral resource endowments in developing countries should be a springboard or a platform on which long-term sustainable economic growth can be based. I mean, if you do have wealth buried in the ground, is it better just to leave it there? Or is it better to actualize it somehow and integrate the consequent industrial activity and wealth generated, revenue flows to governments and so forth, the investment in poverty reduction programs and all that? This was the vision. And the main reason why there was a huge problem all across the developing world was that there are very, very few governments in the developing world that have the ability or the inclination to actually discharge their responsibilities to their own public in a meaningful and productive manner. I mean, they don't have environmental regulatory departments. They ignore human rights in many issues. Sometimes they actually fight against communities and repress them. So the question was, if you are going to translate this mineral resource endowment, this potential wealth-generating asset for the developing country, into something that is beneficial for the country, And certainly the bank was not looking at doing what was most beneficial for mining companies. Their focus was on what's beneficial for the developing countries. But the way to get there is to allow market forces to work through mining companies. And so that was a challenge. Can you get there with deficient governance on the part of governments in countries? And governance is a bigger issue than governance, which I'd like to talk about a little bit later. Can you get there with deficient governance in the state using private sector actors, mining companies? And they said, well, the only way that can be done is through some other kind of regulatory mechanism that will govern, determine their actions. And that's how the IFC Social Environmental Performance Standards came about, which are really very prescriptive. And they relate to such issues as environmental management controls, as the resettlement of population groups, as the protection of biodiversity, as the engagement with indigenous peoples, and so forth. I mean, the most recent updating of them includes the principle of prior informed consent of indigenous populations group before a mining project can proceed. So that's what the standards are all about. The problem with the standards, of course, is getting everybody to implement them, enforcing them, providing sanctions that are not implemented, and that's still a huge issue. And you know, I think, and this is jumping into the second theme in a sense, but when a mining company is operating as in Guatemala and goes before a court in Canada, one of the questions before that court is going to be, did you really implement the social environmental performance standards of the IFC? Or were you lax in that? Because that was the standard to which you should be expected to be held accountable.
Well, John McCain has worked a lot on the problems of accountability, and I wondered if you could share your reflections on the interaction, if you will, between the standard setting happening through CSR and the reality that you see on the ground.
The reality that I see on the ground is primarily from a Canadian perspective. And if Davigan was here, is he still here? I was rather hoping to throw up slide number 9. Davigan, is it possible to throw up slide number 9? And I can just comment on the various initiatives. That was number 9, Okay, there we are. Okay, which one? CSR with there's back one. Number 9 you want? Yeah, it says 9. There we are. Okay, all right, there we are. So these are various responses by the Government of Canada to do various things. The CSR counselor, as some has already mentioned, she took her leave this week, or last week, and so we no longer have a CSR counselor. She was mandated to fail. She was created, the position was created in the middle of the debate on C-300, which was the first legislated initiative to try to implement some of the standards that have been talked about in our very well thought out standards for mining companies. So that one's gone. She's had, I don't know, 3 or 4 years of existence. She's had 3 cases, and one of them, I recall the president of the mining company came to me and said, "This is nuts." This one, you know, the whole system is nuts. And he had a very serious case in Mexico, and he was very upset with how the thing was working. So the NGOs were very distrustful of the system, and the mining companies were not too impressed at all. So that one went down. DFAID. Now this is where you use Canadian taxpayer dollars in order to fund CSR initiatives by mining companies operating abroad. One might question the utility of that kind of model, but you question it, and particularly from the vantage point of the NGO, who receives $1 million, or name your number. That is very problematic. In fact, last night I was at a reception of the Chateau Laurier, where one of the NGOs who is a recipient of these kinds of monies has passed a board resolution which says we're out. We no longer will do this. Difficult, very difficult. Mining development, NGO partnerships, blah, blah, blah. Canadian International Extractive Industries. This is actually not a bad thing. It's 25 million bucks. It's in Vancouver, and all of you are really bright. You could really apply for that money. It's actually, I don't think, such a bad idea. What is missing out of this list is any legislative initiative. Whether it's a legislative initiative to create an ombudsman with real power to sanction, or something such as C-300, or something such as the Dodd-Frank bill, the Carter-Lugar amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill, which is quite modest, but a huge sanction. You have to disclose who you paid, how much you paid, the currency you paid it in, and if you don't do it, you get delisted from U.S. stock exchanges. And that has been the big game changer, because the Canadian mining companies that are cross-listed, they are being forced to comply with that legislation, and suddenly they've got religion. And I don't know, I was going to say, it's a come to Jesus moment, but that's not quite right. That's not fair. It is a bit of a, how about a Damascus Road experience? A Damascus Road experience, that's a better religion nowadays. And the reality is that Canadian mining companies, as of today, because I was phoned just before I left Ottawa, as of today, Transparency International, Revenue Watch, MAC, and PDAC have kind of an agreed upon framework going forward with respect to disclosure on accountability. However, there is no legislated sanction. So my judgment is the industry is actually way ahead of the government. The NGOs, of course, are ahead as well. And the real drag is in federal governments. Until that attitude changes, I don't know that we'll actually get much further than where the industry and the NGOs want to go.
Graham, your observations on the drag in the system, and you've observed this. John McKay said that his on-the-ground perspective was from Canada. You've had a somewhat different on-the-ground perspective. What's your picture of where there are signs of drag and where there are signs of advance?
I'd like to make two overview comments about where I come from in all this, and then perhaps respond to particular comments that have been made. And my goal in responding to particular comments is not like just to do a back and forth, but to point out some differing perspectives. And there are clearly some differences of opinion about a wide range of issues here, and I do it for the sake of discussion and debate and respectfully. But I'd like to delve into a few points. My overall perspective is that this debate should be held at two levels. One is, do we have the bare minimum levels of mechanisms in place now, political and legal, to hold our companies? It could be any type of Canadian company. It could be a mining company, oil and gas, maquiladora, sweatshops, what have you. Do we have the mechanisms in place to hold them to account in our courts or politically through mechanisms like the CSR, if and when they commit crimes, or if and when they commit human rights violations, environmental harms? I don't even think we're even close. It is my general observation. And we're on the road to getting there, and a lot more work needs to be done. I say that as a generalization, not as a black and white statement. And secondly, I think we need to have this discussion and debate about what is the underlying development economic model that we're proposing. There's no doubt that mining is good, mainly for the mining companies, for the investors, the shareholders, the directors. The driving force behind the global mining industry, and again, this is a generalization, is the interests of the shareholders of the company, the directors, and the investors. That's what it's about. It's a business. And it gets mixed up with what is development all about, and is it good for development or not. My experience is limited in this field. I work mainly in southern Mexico and Central America. I unequivocally say that mining has never been any good whatsoever for any of the people in Central America in terms of what are their real short, medium, and long-term needs. And that's just my general position, and I'm not making a condemnation of every mining company everywhere in the world. It plays itself out differently in different contexts, but as a general rule, no, it's not a question we would differ on this as whether there's a few bad apples or not. It's an industry-wide issue, and it's having varying degrees of very serious impacts. Crimes are being committed, livelihoods are being destroyed, forests are being destroyed, environmental harm, health harm, etc. It's a systemic issue. That doesn't mean that every company does it the same way every time, but it's not a question of bad apples. Let me just make a few comments on specific points. One is that sometimes it's said, well, there are people in these countries that want our mining companies there. It's partially true, but it's also they're given a false choice. And again, my perspective is from Central America. It's not like their government comes in, or CETA comes in, the former CETA, or the World Bank and says, hey, we're here to bring development, help you do development. What would you like? None of them would say, we want a mining company owned by foreigners to come in here and set up a mining company. They would say, we'd like investment in agriculture, we'd like investment in irrigation, we'd like investment in health, education, local jobs, etc. They're never given a choice. So when the mining company shows up, yes, there are local people who line up for those hundreds of jobs that might be developed at the local level. But that's not because they want mining, it's because they're so impoverished and they have such a lack of employment to begin with. That doesn't play itself out the same in every single country, but that's a very common issue. With all due respect, I take issue to this question that the problem in some of the countries is the lack of education. Clearly there's a lack of education in many of these countries, but that's not the underlying problem. Why is there a lack of education? Why are we doing business at the governmental level, at the World Bank level, at the company level, at the investor level, with really undemocratic, unjust, and oftentimes racist governments? Again, I'm making generalizations. It doesn't play itself out the same in every single country. But we choose to go and do business with these governments knowing full well what types of governments they are. And then after the fact, we come around and say, well, there seems to be a lack of education and that many of the people live in poverty. Well, duh, they do. These are the types of governments that we're doing business with. And there's a comment that many of the governments don't have the democratic institutions in place and the legal institutions in place to properly govern global businesses. That's also true. But 2 points. It comes back to why are we doing business with these people and these governments we call democratic and these oftentimes military-backed regimes empowering them who then keep in place these very undemocratic, unjust societies. And then secondly, to be more pointed, what is the history of countries like the United States particularly, but also Canada in recent history and going back dozens of years in overthrowing governments that we don't like and putting in place governments that we do like, that we then do business with, and they have weak democratic institutions and weak administration of justice. And I'll leave it at this just to see where the responses come from. But let's take the case of Honduras right now. It's a devastating situation. You saw the percentage. Canadian mining companies have concessions on up to 30% of the landmass in the country. Goldcorp is operating a very harmful mine there. And what did the Canadian government do in 2009? Indirectly supported a military coup against a fledgling, weak democratic government. And for the past 4 years, we have had in place profoundly repressive, unjust government, undemocratic to the core. And then CETA came in and put money into reforming the mining law under the control of this post-coup regime government and put in place laws that are now favoring Canadian mining companies. So yes, the government of Honduras today simply has no capacity or no political will whatsoever to properly govern our mining companies. Now Honduras is an extreme case, an extreme example today, but it serves as a very good case study of how we are involved not on the government policy side and on the corporate side and the investor side, and we're getting it both ways, and the people that are suffering the harms are the people of Honduras who are suffering the mining-related harms.
I actually saw Nama nodding to some of that as you were speaking and acknowledging, I think, some of what you were saying. I wondered, did you have any thoughts about that or comments on that, Nama?
A few things about the industry. First of all, the industry goes where there's stability. If you don't have stability, you're not going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in exploration to see whether or not you may have a mine that may last 20 or 30 years. So if you have conflict, if you have change of governments, if you have wars, that's not a very good environment to work in. And if you look objectively at where conflicts are, generally not that many mining companies around. It could be some form of local mining, some artisanal mining, some government still, a few government control companies, but generally, including Canadian companies, you don't find them active in those countries because it still isn't there. And even Canada here, we, as you hear, we want stable rules, so if we're going to invest, we assume the risk up front to find a mine that we want to make sure that we can manage that risk and don't get an additional risk by having conflicts, change of regulatory regime. Now, with respect to education, if you look at the level of skills of the average worker at a modern mine that is managed responsibly, and the Canadian companies in general do that, it's pretty high. Workers are trained, safety record is good, reported, and you will find that it's an opportunity for training and education. Admittedly, the industry doesn't employ a lot of people compared to other industries, but there are spin-offs, there are ripple effects of the economy which are significant that would not exist otherwise if you didn't have this development. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is done perfectly, but certainly there's a concerted effort by Canadian companies to act responsibly to make sure that effective wealth is propagated into the local economy. I think the lessons that have been learned in many occasions is that mining companies have not understood fully the wide range of stakeholders and the magnitude of potential conflict that may emerge because they have not had a chance to assess properly before getting engaged too far into the exploration mining process. So the PDEC, I'm a director of the PDEC Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. We've developed standards like E3+, and one of the key things in E3+ that calls for responsible exploration is to make sure that you get engaged at the earliest possible stage with the stakeholders, with the communities. If you don't do that, I would agree from what I've heard, it could be a recipe for failure. And that applies equally to what we do domestically, what we do with First Nations, what we do with Aboriginal communities in Canada, or what we even do here in Quebec. Just think of what happened to shale gas. I mean, there was obviously a lack of understanding of what the industry was, and also a lack of understanding of what the stakeholders were when those two came close, and have to discuss what that industry could look like here. So these are a few comments based on my nodding of okay.
Well, I think we'll move into the second theme. I promise you we will have occasion for questions, but I think if we open it up now, we're going to sort of deflect, and I'd like to pull everybody into the discussion as quickly as we can after the third theme. So let me make the bridge in this fashion. You know, Normand has just said, just acknowledged that even for the mining industry, having early involvement of stakeholders, having, as he put it, a stable environment, dare I say, having you know, a social license to operate is something that the industry itself seems to see as important and necessary. If that's the case, what about accountability, legal accountability, and why would we resist? Why would the industry resist the notion that the bad performers, if there are some, could be held accountable even in Canadian courts, perhaps to demonstrate, you know, the fact that Canadian companies are good partners to deal with because there are accountability mechanisms. I wondered if I could turn it to you, Jim. I mean, is there any between being subject to legal accountability in the courts here and operating under CSR standards?
I think the best way for me to address this is to pick up where I left off, which is that in the ideal world, yes, you would be working in a situation where you had a government that was accountable to its population, that held the corporations operating in whatever developing country it was accountable to government. that had a court system that was fair and effective, and could also be used to hold corporations accountable. And we don't have that right now, right? So all these things we're doing, I always say, are focused.
Why not here? Why not in Canada?
Well, I'll get to that. There are a number of issues. I'm not opposed to the fact that Canada may be an appropriate jurisdiction in which to decide a torts claim against a company in some overseas place. I'm not opposed to that in principle at all. But I do think that there need to be certain concerns that are addressed. I have seen this system work in various cases, and there's a phenomenon of what you might call contingency fee-based advocacy by certain law firms, bringing courts to the bringing cases to courts in a jurisdiction where they think there's the most money to be got from a decision. Right? This is not a totally kind of egalitarian, transparent, trustworthy system. Right? There are other issues that need to be considered. Many of these operations abroad are not single company operations. They're joint ventures. Some of them are even joint ventures with the government of the country. And so you have several parents to a project. So, you know, which parent are you going to go after in the foreign jurisdiction of court? I mean, extraterritorial legislation, Canada asserting itself, might be useful. Are all the countries going to start asserting themselves? Are we going to get into this kind of conflict of judicial jurisdictions? I mean, there are things that, you know, it looks good in the first passing. Yeah, these guys ought to be held accountable by putting them before a Canadian judge and getting a good decision against this this company, sending the directors to jail and taking billions of dollars out of their coffers. That might sound good, but I think it's a little bit unrealistic with respect to addressing the real issue, which is a problem of governance, primarily in the countries themselves. I think we need to have other mechanisms established. You know, when a mining company invests in many of the countries of Latin America, it enters into a contractual relationship with the government which establishes an arbitration of disputes offshore. And that's done because the company doesn't trust the courts in the country to give a legitimate or acceptable, you know, unbiased or uncorrupt decision. So why not establish arbitration of disputes offshore by some legitimate mechanisms for these kinds of torts cases? I mean, this kind of arbitration that we're talking about is for things that are company interests. But perhaps there ought to be similar sorts of mechanisms established which would serve as recourse for complaints by communities and other parties that felt that offenses would be committed against them by mining projects. So that's just a suggestion.
Well, actually, if I can follow that a little bit. Under the IFC, there is something of a mechanism like that. The ability to it's not precisely arbitration, but there's something like this. But at the same time, as you know, I'm sure better than I do, there are limits to the effectiveness of that process as well.
Well, I know I've been through arbitration processes. I know there are limits, but I mean, but maybe something where a number of countries bought into. I mean, you have the International Criminal Court, which of course the United States has bought into. But I mean, maybe we need other kinds of jurisdictional recourses, or judicial recourses, I suppose I should say, rather than simply the court system of a single province in one of the countries where the mining company comes from.
Well, maybe I can bring Jamie into this, because Mining Watch, if I understand it, has recently actually taken a position in favor of more judicial access in Canada. And I wondered if you might just share your observations about this.
We, as part of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, we actually have a campaign. If there wasn't enough flyers to go around, I apologize, but it's available on the intertubes at the CNCA website, and there's lots of material there. So this is actually a two-part campaign at the moment. One is for an ombudsman, like a real ombudsman, that can investigate and at least recommend sanctions. And the other is for legal recourse. So a legal cause of action for people around the world harmed by the actions of Canadian companies to come and seek justice in Canada. There's actually, after, you know, we worked on this for a couple of years, and when we've accomplished that, probably after the next election, then we'll turn to economic justice and some of the other discussion that we've had about how developing countries are actually supposed to benefit from mining development. Building on some of the work that's being done on tax justice and transparency and governance. But the thing is, I was agreeing with Jim at first because I think we're seeing some of the same aspects of weak governance, of impunity, of whether it's criminal law or environmental law, human rights protection, you name it, that these laws are not well drafted, not well implemented, and allow for all kinds of abuses to take place. The Colombian Constitution is really nice, and the Colombian legal system is really nice, and it doesn't actually provide justice to an awful lot of Colombians. And yet, there are a lot of Canadian mining companies operating in Colombia. And the question that it raises for me is what conditions have to be in place, or how bad, to turn it around, how bad does it have to be before Canadian mining companies will not invest? Because they're in Eritrea, they're in the Western Sahara, they're in Colombia, they're in Honduras, and happily investing in some of the worst conditions. So I do differ with Normand as well, because there is clearly on the part of some companies and a sector of investors an appetite for stability and long-term investment and stable returns. There is also an incredible tolerance for risk, and and this is justified by fund managers by diversifying. You put smaller investments in a whole range of fly-by-night companies, and most of them will go under, and one of them will hit it rich, and you'll get 1,000 to 1 payoff. The share price will go from 5 cents to $50. You're all set. You may have actually justified the whole gamble, and that is done by also building in massive rates of return. We looked at some of the projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rates of returns approaching 200%. You throw a whole bunch of money in, and after 2 years, you've already made all your money back. So if there's a war going on, if your property gets expropriated, if you're overrun by rebels, you don't care, you've already made all your money back. And that's quite tolerable to, like I say, at least a sector, and not just a few, but some of the majors, not just a few bad apples, but an important sector of the mining industry. So we look at Colombia, and we did a study, and we found that there was no way that any investor, a Canadian mining company in particular, could guarantee that the title to the land it was working on had not been acquired by violence, and that it was not in some way aiding, benefiting from, and supporting the continued violence and dispossession in that country. And this was not a concern. Either the Canadian government, who is in the process of developing a free trade agreement with Colombia, which is now in place, or the mining companies themselves, and it was certainly brought to their attention, and they referenced in some cases the guiding principles on the voluntary principles on security. The Canadian Embassy had been doing workshops on the voluntary principles on security with those companies, but the whole notion that maybe they shouldn't be involved if there were the distinct risk that they would be aiding paramilitary groups and in some cases some people being beheaded to give a message to the rest of the community that they shouldn't be there because, and they were told, a Canadian mining company wants this land. I can go on because, and I won't, but I just want to say that Canada also signed and ratified a free trade agreement with Peru 2 weeks after the massacre in Bagua. No qualms, not a blink on the part of the Canadian government. Canadian mining companies were lined up in the north of that area with gold concessions. And there's a whole different topic about, as Jim mentioned, the tribunals. And the fact is that the investment tribunals function as a way of stifling democracy, not encouraging accountability. We can pick that up later on.
Well, no, Jamie raised a large number of serious questions just now, and one way to maybe tie them together is to recall that Canada had undertaken a national roundtable process not so many years ago on corporate social responsibility in the mining sector, and at that time, PDAC, Mining Association of Canada, which were involved, actually endorsed some pretty significant principles with respect to accountability, including setting up an ombudsman, having some recourses, in Canada, and even some consequences for companies that were, so to speak, bad apples, cutting them off from access to federal funds, cutting them off even from tax benefits. What's happened?
I mean, there was a study done recently comparing the CSR strategy. It was the result of the roundtable process in 2007. Looking at what were the recommendations, and there were 27 of them. How many have been partially or fully implemented? And the number came out as 18. I'm not sure if the other participants have seen that study, but it was done for Mining Association of Canada. Some of them that you just mentioned were not implemented. The PDC was certainly in favor of an implementation. We think, as an industry involved in exploration, that is something that should be revisited. There should be a conversation on that. That needs to take place. That strategy was never designed to be also casted in stone, no pun intended, but something that's something that should evolve, and that's something that should be revisited. We also encourage that as well. Jim,
Well, first of all, I was on that roundtable. And I was part of the consensus formation, which I think most of my colleagues who were on that roundtable, including Catherine, from Mining Watch, and other academics and so forth, still adhere to the recommendations of that roundtable, but would like to see it go farther. One of the really interesting things that roundtable did was it really started conceptualizing accountability mechanisms that were somewhere in between voluntary initiatives and recourse to courts, right? And there's a lot of work that can still be done in that area. The government of Canada, I don't want to get political here, but sometimes that's very difficult to avoid, decided in its wisdom for various reasons that A, it was not going to implement anything like accountability mechanisms. It was going to leave it entirely voluntary. I mean, I think, for example, compliance with the voluntary principles of human rights and security, and compliance with the IFC performance standards, and with the human rights part, certainly of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, should be compulsory, and there should be sanctions for Canadian companies operating abroad that do not adhere, interpret, and adequately apply those instruments. And that was part of what we were recommending. So what we got was this very weak CSR counselor sort of position, which none of us thought was anything like what we had recommended. Doesn't do the job at all. And other elements of this. Now, why did that happen? Well, partly it happened because the current government, at the political level, certainly, I'm talking to somebody that was free to talk about these things. The current government, at the political level, has a high level of trust in the private sector. They actually think that most companies are governed and operated by virtuous individuals who do the right things under circumstances. Now, there are some exceptions, and they end up going to the courts of law. I think that's one problem that existed. The other problem was, how deep did that consensus around that point go? Now, the Mining Association of Canada, to give themselves credit, actually got a consensus of their board, representing the major companies in the mining industry in Canada, to support the recommendations of that roundtable report. PDAC was unable to do that. So Tony Andrews, who was then the president of PDAC, got his personal endorsement to the roundtable report, but he could not say that his membership supported that. There were a number of companies in Canada who were quite offside, not just with the report, but with the whole process. I mean, I know, I won't name names, but I know with a certain degree of conviction that there were very senior people in some mining companies in Canada who were talking to senior people in the government and saying, don't do anything about this. Right? So, you know, we don't really have a national consensus. We don't really have a national consensus as to, you know, how Canada should enforce compliance with these norms, and actually more than norms, highly prescriptive standards for their oil, gas, and mining companies operating abroad. But I would still say that if the government were to do something to strengthen what it's calling its CSR strategy, it would go back to the recommendations that are around the table, and it would actually come closer to implementing it, including the ombudsman role, which John sort of brought in with his Bill C-300, but not the way we proposed it exactly.
Graham, you wanted to jump in on this.
Again, just a few follow-up comments, responding to other comments, and then just two general comments on this whole notion of voluntary self-regulating standards versus binding civil law or binding criminal law. One comment is all of this stuff is political. It's political in the political party sense, and it's political in the broadest sense. And I think a debate like this tonight really goes beyond some of the stuff we're talking about and what kind of world do we want to live in as humans. We live in a world of profound inequalities inside our country and between countries. And we're having a debate about regulating very wealthy, powerful companies coming from very wealthy, powerful countries, and how their actions are playing out in very poor, exploited countries in other parts of the world. That's the broader issue that we're talking about. And each one has to make their own decision as to how we want to live in this world. And the response to this has to do with the mining industry. It has to do with the McGill sweatshop industry. We had that unbelievable disaster in Bangladesh. We wear their clothes. There's no regulation going on there. Some of our industries responded somewhat nicely in a charitable sense and said, we're going to send over some money for the people that suffered, but we wear their clothes that are produced for cheap in these types of conditions, and we're the beneficiaries of this. And obviously some Canadians benefit more than others. I think we're having that type of discussion. Two brief responses. This notion of stability, that the mining industry goes towards countries that are stable. Guatemala is a stable country. It's a profoundly unjust country. It's racist, it's repressive. The rule of law fundamentally does not work. That's an overgeneralization. There's some amazing cases going on in the courts, but the rule of law doesn't work in any fair and just way. And the democratic institutions, the institutions of democracy are profoundly corrupted and weak, but it's very stable. So I don't want to beat this issue too much, but I don't think our mining industry has that much qualms about where it operates around the world, and they define stability in terms of whether they can get in, make a profit, and get out. Bit of a simplification, but I wanted to respond to that point. I also don't agree with the comment in general that there's these very beneficial ripple effects at the local level. Yes, there are some economic benefits at the local level, but they're short-term at best. Once the mining operation's gone, the devastation that is occurring at the ground level in many instances far outweighs any short-term benefits that local people with unskilled labor have benefited from jobs. And I refer back to my earlier comment. They wouldn't want if they were given a real choice on what kind of development investment they would want, they wouldn't be choosing mining. About these standards in general, the problem with voluntary self-regulating standards is in the phrase itself. They're voluntary and they're self-regulating. No Canadian would live by these standards ourselves. I think we're debating and discussing a profound double standard. And to put it the other way, would I at home, in my home community, were I the victim of crimes caused by a corporation in partnership with some investors, whether they were Canadian or from another country, were I the victim of the health harms, the environmental harms, the degradation, me or my family or my loved ones in my community, would I want a self-regulating, voluntary guidelines regime in place? The answer is obviously not. Now, getting to hard law is complicated, I get that. But any ongoing discussion about we should have voluntary self-regulating standards in place, I think is perpetuating a double standard, and that none of us in our own right would want to live by those standards at home. We wanted a bare minimum criminal sanctions for people who commit crimes, directly or indirectly. We want civil law options if and when we're the victims of harms. It's a no-brainer. We need to be moving towards that at a bare minimum. With respect to hard law, we need reforms to our criminal code. We're light years away from that. And it's not just with respect to the mining industry, it's with respect to all industries. This is also not just a Canadian problem, it's a problem around the world, whether it's the United States or European countries. We are giving many of our companies and investors a free walk. They have immunity from hard law, civil and criminal accountability. We shouldn't be perpetuating that. So we need a debate in Canada about reforming our criminal code so that if and when crimes are committed, not just civil harms, but crimes that our government and the legal, the administration of justice has to do by office, advance criminally against them. We're not even close to that. With respect to civil law, we have these amazing cases, the Hudbay Minerals cases, based mainly on common law history, and they have set a tiny precedent, but we need civil legislation reform at a bare minimum. Peter Julian of the NDP put forth the International Human Rights Protection Act. I think that's the name of it, Bill C-354. I don't even know if it's still stumbling along towards as a hearing. It was going nowhere fast. But in term, and it wouldn't have passed anyway, but at a bare minimum, that's the kind of legislation we need so that it gives people from other countries the right to come here and sue our companies or investors or our government if and when they commit harms. It still needs to be fleshed out in court. Two final comments. Legal reforms are not the solution to these problems. This is bare minimum stuff that we need to implement, I think, as a fair and decent society and to put an end to this double standard. Secondly, what are the reforms that the mining industry itself, let alone other industries, most fear? They don't fear more offshore tribunals. They don't fear really the World Bank problem-solving mechanism, even though it's actually being used quite creatively in a case with respect to a Canadian company in El Salvador, Pacific Rim. But they don't fear that. They don't fear voluntary self-regulation. They fear hard-binding law. They still have most of the cards if and when these cases get into courts. Hudbay Minerals has deep pockets and is fighting the lawyers in Toronto, Klippensteins, are not arguing this case sort of pro bono, literally. They are raising funds from here and there. But this is the best case scenario we have, and Hudbay has the deep pockets, and the plaintiffs from Guatemala with the Klippensteins law firm, they're at a serious economic disadvantage in these cases, and that's the best case scenario that we have. But I think at a bare minimum we have to put an end to a double standard and bring about criminal and civil legislation reform.